entirely with what she advocated just a while ago. Now she leads on as if the eradication of interest were even some kind of self-evident fact, despite the further fact that the only reason the basic idea that interest or usury are so adverse to us only prevails by the many disproofs of contrary propositions which I have produced over the present 43 years. Proofs which even disproved her recent opposing proposition that interest isn't even a fundamental problem. Now she advocates spending money into circulation, too, without qualifying arguments. And she does this preposterously now, even as if it were even to her a self-evident fact that interest or usury are inherently terminal, even as she herself fails to articulate exactly why, in terms which intimate also that no, on the contrary, neither can we merely spend money into circulation. This is mere perpetual vacillation, and it is neither the product of authority or even processes which would develop solution. On the contrary, the pattern only deviates from proven solution long preceding her pretended authority, with the consequence of a preposterous busybody being our division. In that division lays the perpetual obstruction of absolute solution, an enmity against the objects of every truly free, just nation. Who among us ever knew the improprieties of any and every present implementation of interest as a self-evident fact? By what terms do we know such a thing, particularly from the account of any purported authority, who not only cannot and has not articulated the fact, but even recently stood opposed to the fact they now prance beyond as if it were merely self-evident? Who among us, then, ever understood the obfuscations of the central banking systems which have been imposed upon the present world as a purportedly self-evident fact? Worse, how can we ever actually understand solution if solution can only be constructed from exacting, intimate regard for every nuance of the fundamental causes of all the problems before us? We cannot resolve our problems otherwise. Failing even to identify fundamental cause, and thus failing to eradicate fundamental cause, we might, for instance, condemn ourselves to no more than believing wrongly that we can outlaw consequences which are inevitable still, until we do eventually resolve and eradicate the fundamental causes of the present injustices. How, in fact, yet, can we possibly be said to understand anything as a self-evident fact if we ourselves lived instead under and according to the worst possible violations of the principles which, at the same time, now, we too merely presume to be self-evident facts? We ourselves have thus lived against ourselves. We even persist in our own obfuscation of the truth until these things are shown to us. And equally opposed to our own objects are we then, if in turn we only look for the necessary answers which will be shown to us not by any plagiarist, imitator, or pretended authority, who neither correctly articulates the problem or its singular solution. Particularly improbable, then, is the idea we make some kind of progress looking to plagiarists who have compromised the possibilities of understanding either cause or solution, because their purpose was to claim some sloppy thing 40 plus years after we could have had solution. And since they did this, even with the audacity to claim purported solution even as the original material from which they steal persists to this day as a proof of singular solution. What could be more self-destructive in no more than the name of a quest for solution, which already existed even in a prescription for transforming any of these purported banking systems into mathematically perfected economy, not only immediately, but even virtually without cost. Instead of solution, then, all this has only given us every proliferating division. Today I'm going to review the recent documentary, Inside Job, narrated by Matt Damon. Why? This award-winning, broadly acclaimed expose excels in its presentation of the material it offers to us. Of course, we heard regularly of the crimes addressed by this piece, and yet to be taken through this material again, so well organized, so evident in the interviews which portray deceivers for what they are, of course compels good people to unite against what can only complete our destruction if we tolerate any of this further. The problem which I hope to convey is that however well done this piece may be, by failing to reach down to the fundamental causes of the issues which confront us, it wrongly leads us to think that we can outlaw what are consequences of the underlying fundamental crimes, which will ensure our destruction no matter how many purported bankers commit further crimes with our promissory obligations to each other. To what ultimately is an utterly futile extent, then, the division of our 11th hour's pretended authorities to robs Inside Job of the real truth, the whole truth, and the only message which can really save us. What I am saying is that the necessary message was to relate all this to the fundamental cause of failure, which is the imposition of an ever unascended system of exploitation, which can only multiply artificial debt into terminal sums of artificial debt. Falsifications of collateral and worth in turn then can be understood as the whole crimes they are, which is not merely to convict criminals for merely the downstream facts of these crimes, but instead is to convict them for willingly taking license from an underlying crime which would destroy us still, even practically as quickly, without a single further crime as purportedly exposed by this documentary. Only by understanding the underlying crime of the obfuscation of the currency can we truly understand how to avoid our destruction. As Inside Job begins, it opens with a screen which reads, "The global economic crisis of 2008 cost tens of millions of people their savings, their jobs, and their homes. This is how it happened." They begin the story in Iceland. Gross domestic product, 13 billion. Bank losses, 100 billion. But can and does this story really begin in 2008?
Iceland is a stable democracy with a high standard of living, and until recently, extremely low unemployment and government debt.
We had the complete infrastructure of a modern society. Clean energy, food production, fisheries, with a quota system to manage them.
Good health care, good education, clean air, not much crime. It's a good place for families to live.
We had almost end of history status.
But in 2000, Iceland's government began a broad policy of deregulation that would have disastrous consequences. First for the environment, and then for the economy. They started by allowing multinational corporations like Alcoa to build giant aluminum smelting plants and exploit Iceland's natural geothermal and hydroelectric energy sources.
Many of the most beautiful areas with the most spectacular colors are geothermal. So nothing comes without consequence.
The problem with this scenario, as they're developing it here, is that the listener or the viewer may simply assume that somehow Iceland would have continued to be a world leader in prosperity if somehow the further developments which are about to be presented did not transpire, in which they describe these banks of Iceland ultimately purchasing what are bad debts. But the whole purpose of banking is exploitation by debt ownership. Now, the question isn't really simply then whether whatever purported assets in these bad debts which are about to be described, whether those are truly merely bad or excessively ambitious purchases. What is really at issue is that the fundamental obfuscation of the currency engenders these bad debts, and thus it's actually expectable in a world which is a captive subject of these systems of exploitation, that these debts, which are multiplied into terminal debts, may come to be owned by other peripheral banks, which prosper more than other peripheral banks, which are destroyed by the fact that the populace to which they have lent, ultimately and inevitably to excess, that those banks come to fail. So this trading is actually an inherent and inevitable consequence of the obfuscation of the currency. Now, obviously, we would expect